Shalom Aleichem, welcome. I'm Lisa Newman, the Yiddish Book Center's Director of Publishing and Public Programs, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's Yiddish Book Center's virtual theater for today's book talk with editor and translator David Stromberg. It's presented as part of the 2024 Yiddish Book Center Great Jewish Books Club. Following today's talk and conversation, you're all invited to stay on for our breakout discussion sessions, which will be led by my colleague, Sebastian Schulman, the Center's Director of Special Projects and Partnerships, including the Great Jewish Books Club. Before we get started, a few things to note. In this part of the program, your video will be off and your audio will be muted. You may send us some short questions, which we will try to get to before we move over to the breakout sessions and discussions. It's my pleasure to welcome David Stromberg. David is a writer, translator, and essayist whose work has appeared in the American Scholar, Critical Flame, Smart Set, Public Seminar, and the Los Angeles Review of Books, among others. He is editor of Old Truths, New Clichés, a collection of Isaac Bashevis Singer's essays. His recent work includes A Short Inquiry into the End of the World, the first speculative essay in his Mister Investigator series, and his follow-up, The Eternal Hope of the Wandering Jew, which appeared in the Hedgehog Review. David is the editor and translator of the recently published Isaac Bashevis Singer's Writings on Yiddish and Yiddishkayt, The War Years 1939 to 1945, Volume 1 of what will be a 3-series edition published by White Goat Press. Welcome, David.
Hi. Hello, everyone. Hi, Lisa.
Great to see you over there in Israel. And thank you for joining us at this late hour over there.
Of course, of course.
So I thought we would get started and we'll do a little bit of a mix of conversation and some readings from the work. So maybe to get us started on this, could you speak a little bit about how you curated this collection of essays, which I know started out on a spreadsheet as 150 potential essays for Volume 1, and you masterfully curated it down, if I may say, to 25?
Yeah, it was a process of discovery and elimination, I guess you could say, both the process of discovery and of elimination. That was in dialogue with you and others at the Yiddish Book Center. I think that was an important part of getting a few different people to chime in on what topics sounded interesting to them, and then taking all that information and whittling it down little by little, getting into the actual materials, slowly starting to translate, and then feeling through that and sort of gaining more knowledge and experience about what might work as the process went, continued.
And also, before we jump full in, the title Yiddish and Yiddishkayt. I've heard you speak a little bit about this, and I wondered if you could share your thoughts on that with our participants.
Yeah, I mean, it's also in the introduction, but essentially, when I sort of looked at Bashevis Singer's all of his nonfiction writing in the Vorwort, I came up with 3 general topics, one of which was sort of art and literature. Another was kind of the human spirit and personal philosophy, but the one that was sort of very both broad and unique was Yiddish and Yiddishkayt, because he, even though I think in Yiddishist circles he had the or in Yiddishist scholarship, I would say, he had the reputation for being less interested in Yiddishism. He was actually extremely concerned about the language and the culture and everything that was lost, as we see in this volume, and he wrote about it all of the time, in these articles and many others. And so being able to focus on that, on his specific thoughts and relationship to Yiddish felt very important. And then Yiddishkayt, in the sense that he was on some level became one of a few people, but one of the early sort of religious writers, you could almost say, for the Vorwärts, writing about different topics, or different traditions or different holidays, and sort of educating Yiddish-speaking American readers about the religious elements of life in the old country, let's say.
So he wrote these pieces in America, and he used a lot of different bylines when he was writing these. And in your introduction, if I may, you write, while the average Yiddish reader of the forwards may not have known during this time period that Yitzhak Warshawski, excuse my pronunciation, under whose byline most of these articles appeared, was Yitzhak Bashevis, the younger brother of Yiddish writers Esther Kreitman and Israel Joshua Singer. It is possible to imagine that the same reader, wondering about the identity of Isaac from Warsaw, whoever he was, he had a lot of opinions about the situations of Jews in both Europe and the United States before and during World War I, as well as the future of Jewish life in America. He was an unknown entity, but anyone reading his work could tell that he was deeply invested in this topic. I think there's a lot packed into this, and I wonder if you can expand on it a little bit and then maybe read from one of the selections that you have chosen, which may speak in some ways to what I just borrowed from your introduction.
Sure. Essentially, the weird thing we could say about Warshawski, especially in literary circles, was that in the Yiddish literary circle of 1939 to 1945 in New York, everybody knew each other. So, and if you were a reader reading some of these authors, you probably knew many of them or about some of them. And so suddenly there's this person who has a lot to say, very consistent, has a lot of knowledge, not the kind of personality that would be easy to miss, and yet doesn't publish anything outside of these articles. So there's no books by Yitzhak Warshawski for some reason, but he keeps talking about in other articles about writing books and what needs to be written and how it needs to be written, or in these articles about Yiddish literature, etc. And you, as a reader, I imagine myself, if I put myself in the shoes of a reader, I say, well, who is, like, if this is what this guy has to say, where's the things he's actually where are the things he's actually writing? And then you turn and there's no books by that person. And in a way, the flip of that is how I got this material, because I was reading Isaac Bashevis Singer, who was referencing these essays or whatever. But then when I turned to, purchase the book or to read the book from, to check out from the library his book of essays or his book of writings on these topics on Yiddish and Yiddishkayt, it didn't exist. And I said, well, where is this? Where's the missing material? Why isn't it there just like all the other things? So that's, yeah, and just as a preview to the next volume, in the next volume is from 1946 to 1955, for example, and all of the original collection that became known in English as In My Father's Court was published under Warshawski, but a year later the collection in 56 was published under Bashevis. So, if you're paying any attention at all, it shows you that the question of who is Warshawski at some point became a moot point. Although at this point, I think it was still not so clear. So, yeah, like I said earlier, as we were preparing a little bit, given just given the general mood of the world today, I thought that it would be interesting to look at a couple of pieces and to read them or parts of them. The first one is Jews would oppose Nazis even if fascists and Hitlerites were not anti-Semites. And I actually remember, as I'm saying this, I remember I was interested in the piece. I pulled it up just to review it and to begin to start translating it. I was kind of, did not expect to have it open with a quote from Mein Kampf. And the translation of this opening section was interesting in itself because I don't know what and when Bashevis read of Mein Kampf itself, and though he puts this in quotes, it's not clear where he's taking the quote from. But certainly when I'm translating into English, it doesn't necessarily make sense to do a straight translation from his Yiddish translation.
Mm-hmm.
So I found myself suddenly Googling Mein Kampf in both the original text in German and also English translation, which then of course made me afraid about what that's going to leave in my Google history, and what suggestions are going to come up for me. But I ended up trying to find a middle ground between his paraphrase and original and the English translation. So just a little bit of the kinds of things that go into the translation process. But so I'll read a little bit from this piece. I had been investigating the activities of the Jewish people, writes Hitler in Mein Kampf, over long periods of human history, when suddenly I became anxious and asked myself, had destiny not decreed at some point that this small nation should have the final victory? In a conversation with Gregor Strasser, Hitler's former friend and follower, Hitler explained that the greatest and mightiest enemy of Nazism was the Jewish people. Hitler said he was more afraid of Jews and Jewish ideas than English warships or the French army. Hitler explained in a variety of ways that he was waging war against Jewry and only with Jewry. There was a time when Hitler's anti-Semitism wasn't taken very seriously, just as his political program, threats against ethnic groups, and power over the German people were not taken seriously. Hitler was not the first anti-Semite and will not be the last. As long as Hitler did not put words into action, there was no reason for anyone to take what he said seriously. Many Jewish journalists found all kinds of ways to say that Hitler's anti-Semitism was nothing more than a demagogical means with which to trap Germany's ignorant masses in his net. Even many German Jews believed that as soon as Hitler came to power, he would put an end to his anti-Jewish propaganda, which would become useless to him. Many politicians expressed the opinion that Hitler had made a mistake in singling out the Jews. Had Hitler not spoken out against the Jews, these politicians said, he would have had many Jewish followers. But time has shown that Hitler took his program and his views more seriously than anyone could have imagined. Many non-Jews and even Jews think that his hate is built more on political trickery than on any deep internal sentiment. Many thinking people believe that were it to serve his interests, Hitler would wake up one fine day and make peace with the Jews. What wouldn't a dirty demagogue do if it served his interests? Hadn't the same Hitler first praised the Poles and then called them inferior? Hadn't Hitler signed an agreement with the Bolsheviks when it served him? It's not inconceivable that Hitler would in reality make temporary peace with the Jews if it were necessary for his plan. But this in no way proves that the battle between Hitler and the Jewish people is incidental. The deeper you look into the events taking place, the more you are inclined to believe that there cannot be, and never will be, any kind of peace between fascism and Yiddishkayt. When Adolf Hitler says that democracy and socialism are Jewish ideas, he makes no mistake. Hitler feels with his instinct, and he has very sharp instincts, that no matter what happens, Jews will never acknowledge the arrogance of dictators and rule from above. When Hitler says that the existence of Jews is a personal insult to him, he's not pulling it out of thin air. Jews are the living denial of human deities, petty, meaningless creatures who want to make themselves into gods. Jews do not acknowledge authority, but for fascists, authority is everything. The ruler is everything. The subject is nothing. People are born so that their rulers can do whatever they want with them. Jewish internationalism is set up in opposition to fascist, narrow-minded nationalism. Yet it's interesting that fascists want to establish an internationalism of their own. Hitler's goal is for each nation to have a ruler, but for Germany's ruler to be the ruler of all the other rulers. In opposition to Jewish individualism, to Jewish freedom, Hitler puts forth a life that is completely controlled from above. The ruler's word, his whim, his desire must be law for the entire nation. Just as nudists will never succeed in convincing the human race that we should all walk around naked, so the fascists will never succeed in convincing people that they should once and for all strip off all forms of culture, all the forms that culture has introduced over thousands of years. Jewish ideas, faith in justice and in morality, and contempt for violence and cruelty have all entered the blood of the human race. People in modern times fear the sword more than anything else, but rarely do they submit to kissing the sword that cuts their throat. The cult of the hero can no longer exist in its ancient form. The Jewish poison, the Jewish contempt for violence, has had more influence on the world than the fascists can imagine. Hitler's war is lost, not just in strategic terms, but also in terms of its ideas. Hitler, Mussolini, Antonescu, Pétain, they are all at their core like the comic hero Don Quixote, who tried to become a knight at a time when knights were no longer in style. Fascists have succeeded in temporarily gaining power, but this power must and will soon slip out of their hands. And this piece is from September 7th, 1941.
So I have to ask you, I mean, these pieces were, if it's fair to say, and correct me, please, rather ephemeral. They're in a newspaper. They feel also very prescient. And he's writing them somewhat newly arrived in America as a refugee of sorts. And he's trying to sort out what he left behind, a country he's abandoned, how that religion and all those traditions are in America. They're amazing pieces, I think. And I wonder if you know a few things, like, do we know how they were received? Do we know how they may have informed his writing going forward, his fiction writing?
About how they were received, I don't have a lot to say about that. I don't really know. Like I said, I think I can only tell, I try to understand what the context that he was living in might have been to have to come to write such pieces. But certainly, right, this is 41. So certainly there is a focusing in of thematic, existential, cultural, and eventually also narrative issues that all become the focus of all of his very different approaches to them in different stories. So sort of the first step toward writing the kinds of stories for which he's known is to start articulating all of the issues at stake. In his later stories, entire articles might be distilled to a sentence or two. But it's hard to believe that he would have had that sentence or two had he not written a whole article about it. He also had a phenomenal memory. So one of the pieces here, the piece on Elul, the month when even a fish in water trembles, which appeared in 42. He references it in a fiction in a book called The Visitors, which hasn't been published yet in English. And in that book, which is set in Warsaw in the teens, there's a Yiddish writer who writes an article with that title. So he was able to sort of distill all these writings later into like a sentence or a paragraph or etc. So it's a process of layering, and you can't layer if you don't first articulate things in many words. Yeah.
Which makes me want to ask you, as somebody who edits and translates his work, and knows him pretty intimately, if I may, you must see the evolution of his thought process, and also, yeah, how he finds his way to the work that he writes. I'm not articulating this really well, but I find it fascinating in your seeing sort of, and again, it's not the right way of describing it, a stream of consciousness to some of these pieces. I mean, he's considering some really, heady topics, and he's kind of picking away at them in different ways as he's writing them. So how does this inform your understanding of his writing, I guess, is the shorter question.
I mean, I think that it's a question of understanding how the scope of the thinking. I would say that to me is the part that interests me the most as a writer as well, is how does Bashevis Singer, in thinking about an event happening in real time, use history, use cultural knowledge to put that event in this very broad context, and so to give it a lot more definition, and shading than just conveying the event itself or the facts of the event itself.
Do you want to read from another piece? I think
yeah,
that you wanted. Yeah.
I thought we could also read a little bit from the destruction of Berlin and the destruction of Jerusalem. This is from August 6, 1945. Yeah. We have witnessed almost with our own eyes an event that is, it seems, of the greatest tragic significance. A country that set its highest goal, the annihilation of the Jews, has itself been half destroyed and completely vanquished by its enemies. Berlin is now no less destroyed than Jerusalem was when Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king, besieged and conquered it. It's not clear whether the Romans did more damage to Jerusalem than the British and American bombs, as well as the Russian bullets, have done to Berlin, Hamburg, Cologne, and many other cities. Germans are now being driven out of Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, and Czechoslovakia. The Germans are now getting a taste of the destruction, persecution, expulsion, and all kinds of other things that we Jews know too well. What's totally missing from the destruction of Germany is the tragic element. Hitler used fancy phrases. German philosophers spoke of the dawn of the gods and also used similar rhetorical language. But no person in their right mind feels that Germany is experiencing a tragedy in the highest sense of the word. The Germans themselves don't feel this way either. They're acting like a band of criminals who've been caught and put in jail. Like convicts who land in prison, they think first and foremost about eating. The first question they ask the other prisoners is, how's the food here? How much kasha do you get? Is the soup hearty or watery? Do you get a big piece of meat or a small piece? The Germans' second aim is to be allowed to make friends with their jailers. They want to make friends with the Americans, the English, and even the Russians as quickly as possible. Millions of young German women are ready to sell themselves. All they need are enough takers. Those who know Jewish history know that the resistance the Jews put up against their enemies is almost as old as the Jewish nation itself. After a few hundred years of quiet, a whole series of invasions began in the land of Israel. Egypt, Assyria, Babylonia, Persia, Greece, Rome, every powerful empire of the time fought with the small, nearly unarmed people of Palestine. Every great ruler tried to force their gods, their language, and their authority onto the Jews. All of them wanted to intermix with us. Beginning with Shechem, son of Hamor, who suggested that we give them our daughters and they give us theirs. They have all proposed the same thing to us. Why should you suffer? Why should you remain a minority, foreigners? They argued. Let's make a match and you'll be rid of all your troubles. Anyone who has ever been interested in the essence of tragedy knows that tragedy can only exist where there's personality. Anyone can suffer. Even an ox suffers when it's shoved or breaks a leg. But tragedy is more than simple suffering. Real tragedies represent only the suffering of the proud, those who will not surrender. Jewish fate is tragic because we have taken our burden upon ourselves. A powerful feeling of pride will not allow us to intermix with our oppressors, to efface our uniqueness. We Jews are not racists in the sense that the word is understood today, but all Jews feel in their blood and in their minds there is a collective spiritual and moral treasure that's a shame to lose. We Jews have failed not once but countless times. But it was precisely these failures that lifted us up. There was no blow that could bring us to our knees. Even the latest massacres haven't fundamentally changed our way of thinking. People who have enough personality to be tragic can rarely understand those whom no misfortune can render tragic. They are sentenced to decades in jail, but the only thing they think about is an extra piece of meat or how to swipe a bit of sugar or a cigarette from another prisoner. They lie in hospitals for the chronically ill, but they think only about how to pull dirty tricks on the new patients who are brought in. They are often shoved, chased, or beaten for their dirty deeds, but all they think about is petty revenge, trivial thefts, and worthless swindles. Decent and sensitive people ask themselves, what's going on in the minds of people like this? Are they incapable of thinking? Don't they realize where their path leads? Don't they feel pain when they're beaten? Don't they want to be free? Have they no need of love, of family? There are many of us who feel sorry for Germany, but the Germans themselves actually make no fuss at all about what's happened to them. Many correspondents point out that the Germans are remarkably calm. They have no regret. They're not angry at Hitler. They're not even really angry at the Allies. They run from the Russian part of Germany to the American part because they have better food. The destruction of Berlin and of Germany in general does not represent any sort of tragedy. The Germans will adapt themselves at once to these new conditions. They'll serve anyone and plan new crimes. As much as possible, they will infect their enemies with their sickness. From time to time, they'll squeeze out a tear, but its purpose will be to deceive others. For the Germans, the destruction of Berlin is just an episode.
You note that he's writing these in real time as events are unfolding in Europe. What is he reacting to, and how do you imagine he wanted an American Jewish audience to receive this work?
Well, there was a lot of tension and strange tension at the time historically because the Germans had already obviously surrendered. The Japanese had not, and the article is published the day before the atom bomb is dropped, and which means it was written probably a day or two before that. So it's essentially, from a European perspective, the reckoning has begun. Right, it's been going on since May, essentially, right? June, July, a few months at that point. And so there's a shift there from we're losing this, we're losing this, we're losing this, we're losing this, to okay, now we have to reckon with what we've lost. And I think there's I mean, I don't know if it's conscious or not conscious, but I read it as a clear distinction between the tragic loss of European Jewry, especially Eastern European Jewry, but not only, but basically the loss of all Jewish life in Europe, more or less, or most of, as opposed to a reckoning with the real destruction of a big country. Syria is a very powerful and influential country, and he's trying to say, we can't. Not all destructions are created equal. And this is kind of, again, another example of him starting to create patterns of processing things on the biggest possible scale, all the way from biblical times up to today, right? The destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of, it's not the destruction of Polish Jewry, it's the destruction of Jerusalem, right? The Churban. And so again, he's setting out the stakes. Yeah.
And how hard was it for you to, edit it down to, okay, we're going to choose these 25 because that's sort of what we had agreed we would do in the volume. And how did or didn't you decide in doing that how to create some kind of thread or connective tissue for the 25?
Yeah, I mean, it was, if you look at the dates, you see that the first few are written up through about 1941, 42. And then very much the rest are 1944 and 45. So it's not a perfectly balanced number from each year in that period, because his thinking developed and his approach to the style of writing these kinds of pieces developed. And I think his ability to think about these issues in this complex way also became more developed and more sharper. So it was a question of, giving readers as much access to as many different kinds of pieces, written over that time. And then also allowing that to have a kind of a variability from piece to piece, so it didn't feel repetitive. I think those are the main concerns that I had thought about as I was picking the pieces themselves, so that out of this raw material, there was something that had some sort of, I don't know, if a thread or some sort of feeling of coherence to it.
Yeah. Well, hats off to you. You did it really well.
Thank you.
And going from just being able to look at titles translated in English to seeing what they were all about was a fascinating process. I'm going to take two quick questions and toss them your way from our audience, and then I think we'll do the breakout sessions, this is a whole new thing for us and very exciting. At the time I.B. Singer was writing these pieces, was there published questioning of who Warszarsky, and again, I apologize for my bad pronunciation, could be? Was anyone figuring it out in any Yiddish language papers, who he was from the way he was writing, from his style, and from his religious knowledge?
I haven't come across anything like that. It's possible that was the case. I haven't come across that. Certainly, like I talk about this in the introduction to the second volume, and I kind of mentioned it. With time, it became, because of these kind of markers, became harder and harder to, I don't know, hide isn't exactly the word, but to avoid the reality that Yitzhak Bashevis and Isaac Bashevis were the same person. But at this point, I'm not that I know.
Another one from our audience. I believe Samuel Belkin made some derogatory remarks about Bashevis in comparison to Chaim Grada. Do you think the distinction between the two regarding Yiddishkayt holds? Sorry.
You know, rivalries are rivalries. I don't find them very productive, frankly, and I think that ultimately the main point to understand is that Chaim Grade and Bashevis Singer had different visions, and they had different achievements that they wanted to realize, and they had different marriages in which they had to realize those ambitions, different family situations, home situations, and each one pursued what he believed was right in the way that he could. And I think that, you know, the emotions that exist between people who write at the same time and are both trying to achieve certain, like I said, reach certain achievements, they're real. I'm not saying that they have no validity or justification. But I think that the real place to judge is with each person in relation to what they wanted to achieve. And I think that if you understand Bashevis Singer in relation to these pieces, or relate these pieces to what he did later, you just see the threads, and so what you see is just, from his own perspective, an extreme amount of consistency, actually.
And I think it's what's so amazing about beginning the work of bringing out so much in translation. Every language, every literature has different writers, and they're all going to have different perspectives.
Yeah.
Yeah. So David, thank you so much for joining us for an amazing work. Isaac Bashevis Singer's writings on Yiddish and Yiddishkayt, The Warriors, 1939 to 1945 by White Coat Press, the Yiddish Book Center's imprint. It's available online at shop.yiddishbookcenter.org or at bookstores everywhere. And so looking forward to volume 2, which will be out next fall in 2024. And I can tell you, having read a little bit of what you've translated, it's it packs a punch. It's amazing. So thank you. Thank you,
Thank
David.
you. Thank you.